For years, people wondered how a man so small in stature carried a force that could move millions without ever lifting a weapon. But the real mystery began long before the marches, long before the spinning wheel, long before the world called him Mahatma. It began in the quiet corners of a child's conscience, corners he did not yet understand. And perhaps the most haunting question is this: what unseen hand shapes a destiny long before the one living it knows what he is becoming? Good evening and welcome back to Wisdom by the Fireside. Tonight, in this figures story, we walk into a life many think they know, yet few have ever looked at closely enough to feel its tremors from within. In tonight's journey, we return to the beginning, the tender, unpolished years of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, the boy who would one day shake an empire. But before the world saw a leader, it witnessed a child wrestling with fear, identity, and the weight of expectations he did not ask for. And perhaps the most important question that shadows this entire story is this: what does destiny do to a man before he has the courage to follow it? Because Gandhi was not born fearless. He was not born resolute. He was not even born confident. His life began with quiet hesitation, with shameful secrets, with mistakes he would later confess in painful detail. And maybe that is where his greatness truly began. Not from perfection, but from a relentless honesty with himself. Mohandas was born in 1869 in Porbandar, a coastal town in western India. His father, Karamchand Gandhi, was a respected chief minister, stern yet principled. His mother, Putlibai, deeply devout and disciplined. From her, he inherited a softness of heart. From his father, a sense of duty. But neither could prepare him for the swirling paradoxes he carried within. He was an anxious boy, afraid of the dark, afraid of ghosts, afraid of failure. He trembled at the slightest reprimand, and yet he was also stubborn, fiercely self-critical, and painfully sensitive to guilt, traits that would one day shape a moral force unimaginable in his youth. But as a child, these qualities tormented him more than they guided him. There was a moment, years later, when Gandhi would write openly of his own youthful shame, a small theft of gold from his brother's armlet. His conscience tormented him so severely that he confessed to his father in writing, tears falling as he placed the letter before the old man who lay ill in bed. Instead of anger, his father responded with silent forgiveness, an act that broke Gandhi far more than punishment ever could. He would later say that this moment planted within him a seed, the power of truth and vulnerability. But even then, he did not know what that seed would become. And perhaps that is how unseen guidance often works. It whispers before it commands. Yet the child who discovered the weight of honesty was also a child desperately trying to imitate a world he longed to belong to. Gandhi tried smoking at a young age, driven by a childish desire to appear bold like his older relatives. He even contemplated taking money to fund the habit. These were small rebellions, but to him they were spiritual earthquakes. His conscience was too loud to allow secret sins to sit quietly. He felt watched, not by his parents, not by society, but by something beyond both, a sense that life was shaping him through the consequences of every misstep. He simply didn't know how far those consequences would reach. But even more haunting was the conflict over courage. Gandhi, the future symbol of fearless nonviolence, began life terrified of everything. As a boy, he could not sleep alone. He clung to others at night, trembling at imaginary apparitions, and life, in its ironic precision, would later require him to stand alone against an empire. But not yet. For now, he was still a child, learning where fear ends and character begins. When he married Kasturba at the age of 13, a common practice at the time, he entered yet another realm he was unprepared for. Their early years were marked by immaturity, jealousy, and the youthful arrogance of a boy who believed a wife existed to serve her husband. Gandhi would later reflect with embarrassment on those days, recognizing how deeply he misunderstood both companionship and responsibility. Yet this too would become part of his transformation. Sometimes life reveals greatness only after revealing one's flaws. And it was around this time that Mohandas first began sensing that his life was not entirely his own. There were too many quiet nudges, too many moments when circumstances closed one door and opened another so precisely that it was difficult not to feel something guiding his steps. He didn't call it destiny then. Not openly, not yet. But he felt it. A faint tug beneath the surface. A sense that he was being prepared for something he did not yet have the vocabulary to describe. And maybe you felt that too at some point in your life. That strange mixture of fear and anticipation, as though an unseen hand is arranging pieces you don't yet understand. Everything shifted when Mohandas prepared to leave India for London at the age of 19 to study law, a journey that would mark the end of his sheltered existence. But before he left, he faced a moral crisis that would echo through his entire life. A vow made to his mother forbade him from touching wine, women, or meat while abroad. A simple vow. But what if breaking it meant fitting in with a new world? What if keeping it meant losing acceptance, opportunity, and belonging? This was more than a dietary restriction. It was his first encounter with a question he would face again and again. When identity is tested by the world, which part of you survives the storm? He boarded the ship with uncertainty in his heart, unaware that the winds carrying him toward London were steering him not only toward a new land, but toward the first major turning point of his destiny. But what he discovered there would challenge him in ways he never anticipated, and force him to confront the kind of man he truly wished to become. And what happened in London would change everything. London in the late 19th century was a world unlike anything Mohandas Gandhi had ever known. The fog that curled through the streets, the towering stone buildings, the cold precision of British manners, all of it overwhelmed him the moment he stepped onto English soil. He had imagined himself stepping confidently into a new chapter. But as he walked through the strange city, wrapped in awkward silence and wearing traditional Indian dress, he felt painfully out of place. And perhaps that feeling was the first quiet reminder that destiny often begins by stripping away one's sense of belonging, emptying a person of borrowed identities so that something true may emerge. He was alone for the first time in his life, far from the warmth of his mother, far from the familiarity of Porbandar, far from everything that once anchored him. But loneliness can be a strange teacher. It can break a man, or it can carve out a deeper room inside him. And Gandhi, though he did not yet realize it, was in the early stages of being carved, shaped, hollowed for a purpose larger than himself. Still, in those first months, the carving felt more like humiliation. He struggled with food, refusing meat out of loyalty to his mother's vow, surviving on bread and bland vegetables. He struggled with conversation, shy and withdrawn, terrified of committing the slightest social mistake. And he struggled with clothing, desperately trying to dress like an English gentleman to avoid ridicule. Some might imagine future leaders as emerging fully formed, but Gandhi entered adulthood timid, uncomfortable, and deeply insecure. He took dancing lessons only to abandon them out of embarrassment. He tried elocution classes to improve his speech, but he trembled so violently during practice that he could barely speak at all. He overpolished his shoes, studied etiquette manuals, forced himself into suits that made him feel like he was wearing someone else's skin. And perhaps this is one of life's invisible turnarounds. The men and women who later become icons often begin as those most desperate to blend in. But destiny has no interest in conformity. It only nudges and then demands authenticity. Yet something subtle began shifting inside him during his years in London. Even as he struggled socially, he found unexpected refuge in introspection. He read widely: philosophy, religion, ethics, works by Tolstoy and Ruskin that would later become pillars in his worldview. He spent long hours walking alone in parks, contemplating the moral puzzles that seemed to follow him everywhere. He could feel something forming inside him, a clarity he had not known in boyhood, as though the city's cold distance allowed him to hear the faint whisper of purpose more clearly, but he could not yet name it. There was a moment, perhaps small to others, but monumental to him, when he was invited to join a dinner where meat was served. The pressure to fit in was immense. One bite, and his vow would be broken. One refusal, and he would again be the odd outsider, the foreigner clinging to outdated restrictions. The internal storm was fierce, and this moment contained within it the lesson that would follow him for decades. When the world demands that you compromise your identity to belong, which voice do you obey? The world or the one that speaks inside you? He chose to honor his vow. It was quiet, simple, unnoticed by others. But that night, Gandhi walked back to his small, rented room with a strange sensation in his chest. Not pride, not relief, but something closer to alignment. As if by keeping one small promise, he had stepped a little closer to the man he was supposed to become. Destiny rarely announces itself with thunder. Sometimes it appears in a single moment of integrity. But he had no idea how profoundly that moment would shape the decisions waiting for him in the future. His legal studies progressed, but without brilliance. Gandhi was not an exceptional student. He worked hard, memorizing with diligence rather than talent. His professors considered him modest, quiet, negligible in debate. No one predicted he would one day face empires with the same softness he now used to avoid arguments. But this was important. The world's expectations of him were low, and perhaps that is why unseen forces were free to mold him without interference. Sometimes the least expected souls are the ones carved for extraordinary work because their humility leaves more room for transformation. When he returned to India in 1891, newly qualified but not yet confident, he expected relief. Instead, he was greeted with grief. His mother had passed away while he was abroad, and out of fear of distracting him from his studies, his family had withheld the news. The loss shook him. How strange it felt that while he had been learning about law and ethics, life had quietly rearranged itself behind him. The timing felt eerie, almost orchestrated, as though the ground beneath him shifted so he would not return merely as a son, but as someone beginning an unseen journey. But what was the journey? He didn't know. Not yet. He tried practicing law in India, but his shyness was crippling. He could barely speak in court without trembling. Clients avoided him. Colleagues overlooked him. His future seemed bleak until, unexpectedly, an opportunity arrived. A modest one-year contract in a land he knew nothing about, South Africa. He hesitated, unsure of the risks, unsure of himself. But something deep inside whispered that the door was opening for a reason, that he was being shifted once again, by forces he could not see, but somehow trusted. He accepted. He boarded a ship. He sailed toward a continent that would test him, break him, remake him. And what awaited Gandhi in South Africa would ignite the first real fire inside him, one that would illuminate the path he was always meant to walk, even if he did not yet recognize the flames. Because the moment he set foot in South Africa, his life changed forever. When Gandhi arrived in South Africa in 1893, he carried with him nothing more than a modest contract, a young man's uncertainty, and the lingering hope that a change of scenery might change his fortune. He expected challenges, yes, but nothing could have prepared him for the shock that awaited him on that first journey by train. It was in Pietermaritzburg, on a cold night that seemed to stretch endlessly, where destiny took its first decisive step toward him. He had purchased a first-class ticket. He was traveling lawfully. He believed naively that professionalism and courtesy would earn him equal treatment. But when a white passenger objected to sharing a coach with a colored man, Gandhi's reality shattered in an instant. He was ordered to move to third class. He refused, politely but firmly. And in that refusal, something ancient and dormant inside him stirred. Moments later, he was forced off the train, thrown out, left shivering on a station platform through the dark hours of the night. And it was in that cold, unexpected exile that a spark ignited. Not a spark of anger, but the spark of awakening. Many years later, Gandhi would recall that night as the moment where a timid young lawyer began his transformation into someone he did not yet understand. But standing alone in the freezing air, he only knew that something had pierced him deeply. Was it humiliation? Was it injustice? Or was it the quiet whisper of a destiny that had finally spoken loud enough for him to hear? Most people, confronted with such a disgrace, would have returned home immediately. But Gandhi did not. There was a strange tug inside him, a sense that walking away would betray something larger than himself. He later admitted that he wondered whether some unseen force had placed him on that platform to confront a reality he'd been blind to, one that millions endured daily in silence. And in that silence, he asked himself a question that would follow him for the rest of his life. If I walk away now, who will I become? But if I stay, what will I be asked to face? The next days revealed the truth of South Africa's harsh racial laws. Indians could not walk freely, vote, own certain properties, or even move without passes. They were called names, pushed aside, treated as though their existence carried no value. Gandhi felt insulted, unsettled, and strangely invigorated. Every injustice, every insult, every locked door seemed to press upon him the same quiet message. You cannot unsee this now. And he could feel something forming inside him. Not rage, not vengeance, but an inner certainty that the pain he witnessed had meaning. Why else would he, of all people, be placed here? Why now? Why in this foreign land where he had no roots, no influence, no authority? The questions haunted him. And yet, the more he resisted them, the louder they echoed. But Gandhi's transformation did not happen through public speeches or bold declarations. Not yet. It began in small private acts. He listened to the stories of Indian laborers beaten for not carrying passes. He visited families who lived in shacks, denied basic dignity. He read the discriminatory laws with trembling hands, stunned that such cruelty could be written so calmly into official documents. And one day, as he walked alone through the dusty streets of Johannesburg, he felt an overwhelming realization. He could leave, return to India, resume a quiet life. But he knew, deeply, disturbingly, that he would no longer be able to live with himself if he did. There are moments in life when destiny corners you gently, offering choices that reveal who you've always been beneath fear and hesitation. Gandhi's moment came when he was asked to help organize the Indian community's response to a new law requiring all Indians to register and carry passes like criminals. At first, he hesitated. Who was he to lead anyone? He was shy, soft-spoken, inexperienced. But something within him pushed forward. It wasn't ambition, it wasn't pride. It felt more like being carried by an unseen current, one that urged him to step into the space life had been quietly preparing for him. At a mass gathering in 1906, Gandhi rose to speak before thousands of Indian residents, a task that once would have terrified him into silence. His voice wavered at first, but as he spoke, a strange calm settled over him. He urged the people not to fight back with violence, but to resist through soul force, truth force, a force deeper than weapons or anger. He didn't call it satyagraha yet. The name would come later. But the seed was planted. A new kind of resistance was being born. A resistance rooted not in victory over others, but in victory over oneself. And that was the twist so few expected. Gandhi was not teaching people how to defeat an enemy. He was teaching them how to defeat fear, how to refuse degradation, how to stand without hatred. He was transforming injustice into a moral battlefield, where the conscience, not the sword, determined the outcome. That night, as the crowd pledged to resist peacefully, even if it meant prison, even if it meant suffering, Gandhi felt something he had felt only faintly before: alignment with a purpose greater than his own comfort. But with purpose came tests. Soon after, he led the community into acts of civil resistance. They burned passes. They protested unfair laws. Gandhi himself was arrested, and in a moment that surprised even him, he felt no fear when the prison gates closed behind him. Instead, he felt something like clarity, as though life had placed him exactly where he needed to be, stripping away the last traces of the timid boy he once was. And yet, this was only the beginning. What happened next in South Africa would test him in ways far deeper than humiliation or imprisonment. It would test his patience, his convictions, his understanding of suffering, and even his own identity. Because the next turning point waiting for him in the years ahead would not come through conflict, but through loss. What Gandhi lost in South Africa would alter the entire course of his destiny. Years passed in South Africa, and Gandhi's life slowly reshaped itself around the quiet storms he faced there. His modest legal practice grew, not because he sought wealth or prestige, but because people began noticing something unusual in the young lawyer, who refused to argue from anger, who listened more than he spoke, who believed that dignity was a right. No government had the authority to distribute like a favor. He moved his family to South Africa, Kasturba and their children, trying to build a life that balanced domestic responsibility with a growing public calling. But destiny does not wait for a man to feel ready. It moves regardless of convenience. And soon, Gandhi found himself torn between the demands of family and the demands of justice. There was a moment, quiet and easily overlooked by others, that revealed to Gandhi a painful truth about his inner contradictions. His wife, Kasturba, once refused to clean a latrine in their communal settlement, feeling it was degrading. Gandhi insisted she do it, arguing that no task was beneath anyone in a community built on equality. Their disagreement escalated into something deeper. She accused him of speaking of equality publicly, while still expecting obedience privately. It struck him harder than any political opponent ever could. That night, Gandhi sat alone in the dim light of their simple home, troubled by the uncomfortable realization that he was trying to reform society while still reforming himself. And perhaps that is one of life's subtler lessons. The battles we fight in public often reflect those we are still fighting internally. But destiny has a way of pressing harder when a person is close to transformation. Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent resistance, still forming like wet clay, was soon tested by a series of brutal crackdowns. Protesters were beaten, imprisoned, humiliated. Many of them were simple laborers with families to support. Watching them suffer for a cause he had advocated weighed heavily on Gandhi. Was he leading them toward liberation or toward needless sacrifice? In the quietness of night, he asked himself whether he had misread the signs of his path. And yet, despite his doubts, something within kept whispering that suffering with purpose was not destruction but refinement, that the anguish he witnessed was shaping something larger than any single victory or defeat. He began organizing protests on a scale he had never attempted before. Workers left plantations, families marched. Communities resisted oppressive taxes and immigration restrictions. And with each new protest, Gandhi found himself stepping deeper into a role he had never imagined for himself. But with recognition came scrutiny, with leadership came responsibility, and with moral authority came the fear of misguiding others. He carried this weight silently, often pacing alone long after everyone else had gone to sleep, wondering whether a miscalculation on his part could break the very people he had vowed to defend. One of the most defining moments of his South African years came during the 1908 to 1913 resistance campaigns. Thousands of Indians crossed borders illegally to protest the unjust pass laws. Gandhi led them, and though he had prepared himself for prison, he was unprepared for the emotional cost of seeing wives separated from husbands, children left without fathers, entire families thrown into uncertainty. He questioned whether nonviolence was enough, whether moral force could truly move an empire built on iron and arrogance. And then life, in its strange precision, delivered a personal blow that cut deeper than any political loss. The death of his father-in-law, followed soon after by the prolonged illness of Kasturba. He found himself torn between public duty and private love. The world saw Gandhi the leader, calm and resolute. But behind closed doors, he was Gandhi the husband, Gandhi the son-in-law, Gandhi the man wrestling with guilt. He wanted to be by Kasturba's side constantly, yet every time he stepped away from his work, news of fresh injustices pulled him back. There were moments when he doubted everything, moments when he wondered whether destiny had placed him on a path too heavy for a single man to carry. But even in despair, he sensed he could not turn back. It was as if life kept placing him at crossroads, where returning to safety always felt more painful than walking into difficulty. And then came a loss he never forgot: the death of his son Harilal's newborn child. Gandhi was devastated. He knew the young couple had struggled financially and emotionally, while he was consumed by public battles. The grief weighed on him with a familiar heaviness, the sense that every step towards serving the world pulled him further from the duties of fatherhood. Harilal, already feeling overshadowed by the rising image of Gandhi the leader, drifted further into resentment, and Gandhi could feel the fracture widening. It became one of the great unspoken sorrows of his life, that while he fought for the dignity of millions, he struggled to protect the emotional well-being of those closest to him. Yet, in the darkest moments, something remarkable occurred. The Indian community, fractured by caste, language, and class, began uniting. People who once refused to eat or pray together now marched side by side. Women stepped into public resistance with unprecedented courage. Even some Europeans began acknowledging the moral weight of the movement. Gandhi saw this unexpected unity not as a product of his leadership, but as a sign that when suffering is faced collectively, something higher than individual ambition begins to shape the course of events. And if this was not destiny nudging him forward, what was it? By 1913, after nearly 2 decades in South Africa, public pressure forced the government to amend several discriminatory laws. It was not complete justice, not even close, but it was a shift. The first shift. The kind of shift that suggests a much larger story is waiting on the horizon. Gandhi felt the pull of India again, as though the land itself was calling him home. He did not yet know how enormous the struggle awaiting him would be. He only sensed that everything he had learned, the humiliation, the resistance, the suffering, the victories, the losses, were all preparations. He boarded a ship back to India in 1915, not as the timid boy who had once left for London, nor as the inexperienced lawyer who had arrived in South Africa, but as a man whose destiny had finally woken. Still, he could not imagine what awaited him. How could he? Because the India he was returning to was a land trembling with unrest, injustice, and longing, and the role it would demand from him would eclipse everything he had faced so far. And the first challenge waiting for Gandhi in India would strike at the very heart of who he believed he was. When Gandhi returned to India in 1915, the land that greeted him was both familiar and foreign. Familiar in its sense, its rhythms, its colors, yet foreign in its political atmosphere, which pulsed with urgency. India was no longer merely a colonized nation. It was a nation questioning its own identity, aching under the weight of injustice, and searching desperately for a new kind of leadership. Gandhi stepped ashore quietly, without fanfare, unaware that thousands of eyes, most belonging to people he had not yet met, were already turning toward him as if sensing that something in him had shifted during his years abroad. But destiny rarely announces its intentions. It begins softly, arranging people and events until the path becomes undeniable. At first, Gandhi resisted the idea of diving immediately into political activism. He sought guidance from Gopal Krishna Gokhale, one of India's most respected leaders, who urged him to spend a year traveling the country before taking any public role. Gandhi obeyed, embarking on a journey that tested him far more deeply than London or South Africa ever had. He visited villages swallowed by poverty, farmers crushed by unfair taxes, laborers treated as less than human, and families who lived in fear of both colonial officials and native landlords. At every stop, he listened, not as a rising political figure, but as a servant trying to understand the heartbeat of a wounded nation. And it was during these travels that Gandhi experienced a moral shock. he would never forget. He encountered the untouchables, men, women, and children regarded as so impure by societal norms that they were denied entry into temples, homes, and public wells. Gandhi felt a deep discomfort, a sense of shame that this cruelty existed within his own people, his own culture. It troubled him more than British rule, more than legal injustice, because it revealed something painful. Oppression was not an exclusively foreign presence. Sometimes it grew from within. Sometimes the chains were forged by one's own society. This realization struck Gandhi with an emotional force he had not expected. How could he demand equality from the British while his own country denied dignity to millions of its own? He wrestled with the contradiction, pacing alone during the night, sensing that this was the moment that would test not his leadership, but his conscience. And as he reflected, he felt that same quiet inner tug he had felt in London and South Africa, the whisper of a path unfolding, urging him to confront not only external injustice, but internal hypocrisy. This would be one of the dilemmas that shaped his entire life. Can a nation fight for freedom while refusing freedom to its own people? The answer he formed was simple, but terrifying. No true liberation could come without moral transformation. And that transformation had to begin with himself. But before he could address the social wounds festering within India, a political storm arrived that forced Gandhi to step into the national spotlight far earlier than he intended. In 1917, news reached him of the suffering in Champaran, a region where indigo farmers were forced by British planters to grow crops that left their families starving. The farmers had pleaded with leaders for help, but no one had dared challenge the powerful British landlords. No one wanted to escalate tensions. No one wanted to be the first to stand up, until someone asked Gandhi to intervene. He traveled to Champaran quietly, expecting to observe and offer guidance. But when the British authorities ordered him to leave immediately, he faced a decision that would define him: obey and preserve peace, or disobey and risk imprisonment for the sake of men he did not know. Standing before the magistrate, Gandhi announced that he would not leave. His voice trembled slightly, but his conviction did not. For the first time in India, he stepped openly into civil disobedience. And in that moment, something irreversible happened. People began to see him differently, not as a polite attorney or a spiritual thinker, but as someone willing to bear consequences for the truth. Champaran became a turning point. Gandhi gathered testimonies, exposed abuses, organized volunteers, and negotiated reforms that significantly eased the suffering of the farmers. It was not a complete victory, but it was a powerful one. Ordinary people witnessed a man who did not shout, did not threaten, did not strike, and yet moved the machinery of power simply by refusing to cooperate with injustice. And perhaps that is why Champaran left such a mark on the national psyche. It revealed a method of resistance that transformed weakness into strength, silence into force, suffering into leverage. But Gandhi's work did not come without emotional conflict. He struggled privately with the growing reverence people showed him, people touching his feet, calling him Mahatma, seeing him as something larger than life. It troubled him deeply. He feared that admiration could cloud judgment, that reverence could place him on a pedestal he did not deserve. He knew all too well that he was flawed, still wrestling with anger, still learning patience, still navigating the complexities of his own household. Destiny was sculpting him publicly, but he was still polishing himself internally, unsure whether he was worthy of the role he was being pushed into. And yet, the currents of history do not pause for self-doubt. Gandhi's next challenge emerged almost immediately in 1919, when the British government passed the Rowlatt Act, a law allowing imprisonment without trial. Protests erupted nationwide. Fear spread, and a tragedy unfolded that would scar Gandhi's heart forever: the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, where hundreds of unarmed Indians were shot without warning. Gandhi felt the nation's grief like a physical blow. He wondered whether he had misjudged the readiness of the people for mass resistance. Had he underestimated the potential for violence? Had he, by encouraging civil disobedience, opened the door to chaos? In those days of turmoil, he felt a moment of profound heaviness, as if destiny had suddenly pressed its full weight upon him. But he also sensed, though faintly, that the path he was on was no longer one he could abandon. Something larger than himself was unfolding in India, and he had become woven into its fabric. And what Gandhi chose to do next would change the entire direction of India's struggle and reveal a hidden strength within him that he had never fully understood until that moment. The shock of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in 1919 left Gandhi shaken in a way that went beyond politics. This was not simply an atrocity committed by a brutal colonial regime. It was a moment that exposed, with painful clarity, how fragile the line was between peaceful resistance and violent chaos. Thousands of Indians who had previously believed in the fairness of British law now felt betrayed. Anger surged like a storm across the nation, turning grief into fury. Gandhi saw it in the eyes of young men, in the clenched fists of ordinary workers, in the trembling voices of mothers who had lost their sons. And he realized something terrifying. A nation that had been patient for too long was now ready to explode. He retreated into deep contemplation. He walked for hours alone. He prayed. He wrote. He questioned himself. Had he stirred the people too soon? Was resistance without violence truly possible? In a land where wounds ran so deep and where provocations were so severe, he had believed that soul force could transform an empire. But now he wondered if he had misjudged human nature, or worse, misread his own calling. And yet, through the fog of doubt, he sensed a quiet truth rising. Perhaps this moment of national rage was not meant to break his movement, but to refine it, to force him to define nonviolence not merely as a strategy, but as a discipline requiring sacrifice from both leaders and followers. And so, Gandhi made a decision that shocked everyone. He suspended the nationwide protests he himself had encouraged. Critics erupted. Allies were confused. Supporters felt betrayed. But Gandhi saw a danger they did not: the fire of anger creeping beneath the surface of the freedom movement. If it spread unchecked, it would burn the very moral foundation upon which the struggle depended. For Gandhi, nonviolence was not about avoiding conflict. It was about ensuring that the means reflected the ends. A nation freed through hatred, he believed, would inherit hatred. A nation freed through discipline would inherit dignity. Still, the criticism hurt him. Many saw him as retreating at the moment of greatest momentum. Gandhi felt the sting of their disappointment. But deep within, he sensed that this crossroads, this painful withdrawal, was not a step backward, but a protection from a destiny India was not yet prepared for. And sometimes that is what unseen guidance looks like. Not a push toward the fight, but a pull away from disaster. But destiny is never idle. While Gandhi reorganized his thoughts and prepared to recenter the movement around discipline, another opportunity arose, one that would reveal the depth of unity India was capable of and test Gandhi in ways he had never been tested before. It came from an unexpected direction: the Khilafat issue. Indian Muslims were grieving the dissolution of the Ottoman Caliphate after World War I. They felt betrayed by broken British promises and feared the consequences for their religious identity. Their leaders sought Gandhi's support, not because he was Muslim, but because they saw in him a rare moral courage. This was a turning point. Gandhi understood that supporting the Khilafat movement would unite Hindus and Muslims in a shared struggle for justice. But he also knew it carried risks. Critics warned him not to entangle India's independence movement with a foreign religious issue. Others feared it would alienate groups already skeptical of him. But Gandhi sensed something deeper. India's freedom could not be built on isolated communities fighting separately. Unity itself was a moral force, perhaps the strongest one. And so, he embraced the Caliphate cause, not as a religious battle, but as a human one. It was one of the boldest decisions of his life. Crowds expanded. Protests multiplied. Non-cooperation became a national movement. People boycotted British goods, schools, courts, and honors. It was a rising tide unlike anything the colonial government had ever seen. For the first time, India felt its own strength. And Gandhi, caught between unwavering hope and constant worry, watched the nation awaken with a mixture of pride and fear. Pride, because India was learning to stand. Fear, because standing without balance could lead to a fall that would take years to recover from. Then, in 1922, tragedy struck. In a town called Chauri Chaura, a peaceful protest turned violent. A mob, enraged after police opened fire, retaliated and burned a police station, killing several officers. Gandhi was devastated. The news hit him like a blow to the chest. Everything he had built, all the moral force he had cultivated, the delicate balance he had fought to maintain, it all seemed on the verge of collapse. He spent hours alone, grappling with a question that pierced him deeply. Was he leading India toward freedom or toward bloodshed? And so he made another decision that stunned the world. He suspended the entire non-cooperation movement. Just as before, critics accused him of cowardice, of abandoning momentum, of misunderstanding politics. But Gandhi was not acting out of fear. He was acting out of conviction. Nonviolence to him was not a tactic to be used when convenient. It was a discipline requiring absolute commitment. Even a single act of violence was enough to pause the struggle, to purify intention, to re-examine the path forward. The British seized this moment of perceived weakness. They arrested him. And for the second time in his life, Gandhi walked into prison not as a defeated man, but as someone who sensed, deeply, strangely, that confinement was part of the shaping he needed. Inside the stone walls of Yerawada jail, he wrote, reflected and wrestled with the contradictions of human nature, including his own. He wondered whether India would understand his decision, whether the movement would survive, whether he had misread the timing of history. But prison brought him something unexpected: clarity. Clarity about the need to strengthen moral foundations before seeking political victories. Clarity about the importance of patience in the face of a restless nation. Clarity about suffering, not as punishment, but as refinement. When Gandhi emerged from prison in 1924, he found a nation changed, a movement fractured, and the path ahead even more uncertain. But he also sensed something else, something faint but unmistakable, the feeling that the next phase of his journey would demand more from him than anything he had yet given. And the challenge waiting for him outside those prison gates would strike at the very heart of India's unity and his own capacity to hold it together. When Gandhi stepped out of Yerawada jail in 1924, the air felt different, not because the world had changed during his imprisonment, but because he had. Prison had stripped away his assumptions, exposed his uncertainties, and deepened his understanding of suffering. Yet the world waiting for him was not paused. It had moved on, in directions both hopeful and troubling. The British were as determined as ever. The Indian National Congress was divided between moderates and radicals, and the unity between Hindus and Muslims, once strengthened through the Khilafat alliance, was beginning to fracture under political strain. Gandhi felt this fracture like a tremor beneath his feet, a warning that the next test awaiting him would not come from colonial rulers, but from within India's own heart. He traveled across the country to observe the tensions himself. In village after village, he sensed a quiet, growing mistrust between communities that once stood together. The end of the Khilafat movement after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire had left many Muslims disillusioned. Hindus, meanwhile, questioned whether their solidarity had been reciprocated. Gandhi watched these shifts with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. He understood more deeply than most that freedom gained amid division would not be true freedom. It would be a victory already wounded at birth. And so, even while others placed political strategy above all else, he placed unity at the center of his efforts, knowing it was the most fragile pillar of all. During this time, Gandhi withdrew from national leadership temporarily, focusing instead on what many considered trivial work: improving sanitation, promoting the spinning wheel, encouraging education, urging the upliftment of so-called untouchables, whom he now called Harijans, children of God. Critics accused him of abandoning the political movement. But Gandhi saw these small acts as essential moral preparation. A nation, he believed, must awaken its conscience before awakening its power. Yet even he did not anticipate how deeply his focus on untouchability would challenge centuries-old beliefs, and how violently some would resist. He founded the weekly newspaper, Young India, to speak directly to the people, not as a politician, but as a conscience of sorts. His words carried gentle force, appealing, questioning, provoking reflection. He spoke about dignity, labor, equality, not in dramatic speeches, but in simple truths that unsettled comfortable prejudices. And in doing so, he found himself confronting not only colonial injustices, but societal ones. He learned quickly that asking people to fight an external enemy was easier than asking them to confront their own traditions. But he could not look away from the suffering he had witnessed. Destiny, it seemed, had placed this burden in his hands deliberately. Amid all this, Gandhi experienced a profound personal loss in 1920, the death of Gopal Krishna Gokhale, his mentor. Though the news came while Gandhi was still in South Africa, the absence of Gokhale's guidance grew heavier as India entered more volatile times. Gandhi felt the loss deeply. There were nights when he imagined what Gokhale might have advised: how to negotiate internal divisions, how to temper radical impulses without discouraging them. Yet perhaps destiny intended this period to stand as a test of Gandhi's independence, whether he could lead without the steady hand that had once shaped his political understanding. But life's trials rarely come singly. While Gandhi worked tirelessly to heal communal tensions, the weight of the freedom struggle continued pressing upon him. He sensed a growing impatience among Indians. People who once embraced nonviolence for its moral beauty now questioned its practicality. Young leaders wanted acceleration, confrontation, visible results. Gandhi understood their frustration. He felt it himself at times. But he also knew, through experience, through reflection, through the quiet voice inside him, that the next major action had to be timed with precision. If launched too early, it would collapse into chaos. If launched too late, it would lose momentum. And so he watched the political horizon like a man waiting for the right tide to carry a ship that was too heavy to move alone. It was during these years of introspection that Gandhi's personal discipline deepened further. He experimented with diet, health, and austerity, not as acts of extremism, but as attempts to refine his ability to serve without distraction. Critics often ridiculed him for it. Admirers romanticized it. But Gandhi himself saw it as practical. How can a man carry a nation's hopes if he cannot first command his own impulses? Yet even here he struggled. His fasts, meant to purify intention and restore harmony, were sometimes misunderstood, or worse, misused by followers eager to weaponize his sacrifice for their own goals. Each time he fasted, Gandhi made it clear, a fast is not a threat, it is an appeal. And yet, the world rarely understood the nuance. One of the deepest emotional challenges of this period was Gandhi's relationship with his son Harilal, which deteriorated further as the years passed. Harilal felt overshadowed by his father's rising moral stature, trapped in an identity he did not choose. He rebelled, converted to Islam at one point, and publicly criticized Gandhi. These wounds cut through Gandhi's heart in ways political attacks never could. He wrote to friends that personal sorrow was harder to bear than imprisonment. And perhaps this is the paradox of destiny. A man chosen to guide millions may still struggle to reach the people he loves most. Despite these internal and external tensions, a new clarity slowly emerged in Gandhi's mind. The next great confrontation with British rule had to be symbolic, moral, and unifying. It had to speak to the poorest Indian while unsettling the most powerful Briton. It had to expose injustice, not through force, but through unmistakable truth. Truth that could not be dismissed or ignored. Gandhi waited, watching signs, listening to the common-sense grievances of ordinary villagers, until one issue stood out in painful simplicity: the tax on salt. Salt, an element so basic, so essential, so universal, was controlled and taxed by the British, forcing even the poorest Indians to pay for the right to use what their own land and seas naturally provided. In that simple injustice, Gandhi saw something extraordinary, a symbol as humble as it was powerful. And when he finally decided to challenge it, the world would witness one of the most iconic acts of civil resistance ever recorded. Because when Gandhi began his long walk to the sea, he was not merely marching toward salt. He was marching toward destiny. The decision to challenge the British salt tax was so simple that many political thinkers of the time underestimated its brilliance. Salt was not a glamorous issue. It had nothing to do with constitutions, assemblies, or high-level negotiations. It was, instead, woven into the quiet rhythms of survival, used by the poorest villager and the wealthiest merchant alike. By choosing salt, Gandhi chose something universal, something intimate, something that revealed injustice in its purest form, the denial of a basic human necessity. He knew instinctively that a movement rooted in such simplicity could awaken even the most passive hearts. But what he did not know was how profoundly this march would shape not only India, but also his own spirit. In early 1930, Gandhi announced that he would walk from his ashram in Sabarmati to the coastal village of Dandi, a journey of roughly 240 miles. The purpose was clear: to make salt from the sea in defiance of British law. But the deeper significance lay in the act of walking itself. This was not merely a protest, it was a pilgrimage of truth, a disciplined procession meant to gather the moral force of a nation one step at a time. As he prepared to leave, Gandhi wrote a letter to the viceroy, calmly explaining why civil disobedience was necessary. It was respectful, almost gentle in tone, yet firm in its insistence that no nation has the right to enslave another. The British ignored the letter. History would not. On March 12, 1930, Gandhi stepped out of the ashram at dawn, dressed in his simple cotton cloth, holding a walking stick that would become one of the most iconic symbols of resistance in the world. 78 volunteers accompanied him, but crowds soon grew, lining the roads, walking beside him, offering water and prayers. People left their homes, paused their work, or traveled miles just to glimpse him as he passed. And Gandhi, though deeply moved, kept his focus on the quiet rhythm of his steps. He sensed that this march was not about spectacle. It was about awakening something dormant in the Indian spirit, something that had been waiting for a spark humble enough to make its way into every heart. The march carried him through village after village, where he spoke not of hatred toward the British, but of self-rule beginning within each person. He urged villagers to spin their own cloth, to reject fear, to choose dignity over submission. His speeches were soft, almost conversational, yet they stirred something powerful. And it was during one of these stops that he shared a reflection that revealed the depth of his internal journey. Freedom begins the moment we stop accepting injustice as destiny. He said it quietly, as if speaking to himself. But those who heard it felt the words settle inside them like a seed ready to break open. As Gandhi walked, a transformation rippled across India. Salt, once an unnoticed crystal, became a symbol of moral awakening. Newspapers around the world followed the march, describing Gandhi as a frail man, challenging an empire with nothing but conviction. Some called him a saint, others dismissed him as a dreamer. But there was no denying the magnetic pull of the march. Each mile brought more followers. Each speech deepened the commitment. Each night spent under the open sky reminded Gandhi that his struggle was no longer confined to political boundaries. It was becoming spiritual in nature, a test of endurance and purpose. Yet the march was not without its emotional strain. Gandhi was 70 years old, and the physical toll was heavy. He walked through heat and dust, through swelling crowds and long speeches, through moments of fatigue that would have humbled younger men. But he kept moving, step after step, driven by a force he could not fully explain. Those close to him later said that during the march, Gandhi seemed to carry something invisible inside him, a silent certainty, a steady flame. And perhaps this was Providence, guiding him with a strength beyond his body's capacity. On April 6, 1930, after 24 days of walking, Gandhi reached Dandi. The sea stretched before him, calm and steady, as if waiting for him. He bent down, scooped a handful of salty mud, and lifted it slowly. That simple gesture, quiet, untheatrical, sent shockwaves across India and around the world. By making salt illegally, Gandhi declared that the British had no authority to control the basic elements of life itself. The power of the act lay not in the salt, but in what it represented, the reclaiming of dignity. But the British response was swift and harsh. Leaders were arrested, protesters were beaten, salt laws were enforced with renewed brutality. And when Gandhi announced he would lead a march to raid the government salt works at Dharasana, the British saw it as a direct challenge to their authority. Before he could reach Dharasana, they arrested him. News of his arrest ignited the nation. Thousands of Indians marched without him, and many were brutally clubbed by police. The world watched in shock as peaceful protesters fell again and again, refusing to strike back. And Gandhi, reading reports from prison, felt a mixture of sorrow and affirmation. Sorrow for the suffering. Affirmation that the world was beginning to see the moral imbalance between India and its colonizers. He wrote quietly in his cell, reflecting on the strange path that had led him here. From a timid boy afraid of the dark to a man whose footsteps stirred millions. He wondered, not for the first time, whether he was merely following the currents of history or being carried by something deeper, something unseen that had been shaping him since childhood. Yet, even in the midst of global attention, Gandhi remained aware of a truth he had learned many years earlier. One victory never guarantees the next, and the British, though shaken, were far from defeated. The struggle was far from over, and Gandhi's greatest personal and political tests were still to come. Gandhi's imprisonment after the Salt March marked a turning point, not just for India, but for him personally. For months, he lived within the stone walls of Yerawada jail, cut off from the surging movement he had awakened. The world outside shifted rapidly. Demonstrations erupted, thousands were jailed, and British authority trembled in ways unseen before. Yet Gandhi remained still, confined to a small cell where silence became both companion and mirror. He wrote, spun cotton, reflected and prayed, not with the urgency of a strategist, but with the calm of a man who sensed that history was unfolding precisely as it needed to. And yet, beneath that calm, something unspoken weighed on him. The growing realization that his journey was entering a phase where sacrifices would become far more personal. When the British eventually released him in 1931, not out of benevolence, but out of diplomatic necessity, Gandhi stepped into a political landscape drastically changed by the resistance. The government, shaken by international scrutiny, agreed to negotiations. Thus began what would later be known as the Gandhi-Irwin Pact. Gandhi met with Lord Irwin, the Viceroy of India, not as an adversary, but as a man who believed that respectful dialogue, even with oppressors, was a moral responsibility. Their conversations were civil, even warm at times. Gandhi insisted on the release of political prisoners and the right for Indians to produce salt. Irwin listened. The pact was signed. But the world did not see the private cost of those negotiations. Gandhi knew many freedom fighters would feel betrayed. He knew radicals would accuse him of softness. He knew some in his own movement wanted him to demand far more than incremental concessions. Still, Gandhi sensed that India was not yet ready for a confrontation that would burn uncontrollably. He chose patience, believing deeply that destiny often moves through small openings before storms. But public disappointment still wounded him. Leaders he admired questioned his judgment. Young followers whispered that he was compromising too easily. Gandhi absorbed their criticism in silence, carrying it like an invisible weight, as he prepared for yet another unexpected turn in his journey, traveling to London for the Round Table Conference. In 1931, Gandhi sailed to England, dressed in his simple homespun cloth, barefoot for much of the journey. Reporters from around the world gathered to witness what they saw as a surreal contrast. An empire's representatives in tailored suits and a frail, modestly dressed man with the moral voice of millions behind him. He was invited to elite receptions, political gatherings, and even tea with the king. But Gandhi remained unchanged, calm, gentle, unwavering. Yet the conference itself was a disappointment. British politicians debated legal frameworks and constitutional buffers, but few were willing to address the central question: when would India truly be free? Gandhi realized quickly that he had been brought not to negotiate freedom, but to validate British procedural theatrics. He spoke honestly, with the weight of truth rather than political strategy. But the conference ended without tangible progress. Still, something else happened. Something that revealed Gandhi's unusual gift for touching ordinary hearts. During his stay, he visited mill workers in East London. Dressed in their humble clothes, living in their cramped quarters, they crowded around him with warmth and curiosity. One woman embraced him and said, "Gandhi, you are one of us." And perhaps in that moment, Gandhi understood that while political elites negotiated endlessly, moral truths traveled across continents through human connection alone. But upon returning to India, he found the situation deteriorated again. The British government, now under new leadership, abandoned the spirit of the pact and unleashed repression. Political opponents were jailed, civil liberties were curtailed. Gandhi's patience was tested beyond anything he had experienced before. The calm he carried began to quiver under the strain. Once again, he felt that inner whisper, steady, persistent, reminding him that the struggle was larger than any agreement or political gesture. It was a test of endurance, a marathon of the spirit. It was during this period that Gandhi deepened his work for the upliftment of the untouchables. He knew it was a moral necessity, but many Indians resisted him fiercely. Critics accused him of disturbing religious customs. Extremists attacked him verbally. Some even physically targeted him. Gandhi felt the hostility painfully, but he did not step back. He sensed that destiny was pressing him to confront not external oppression, but the hidden injustices within his own society. This internal struggle reached its peak in 1932, when the British proposed separate electorates for the untouchables, a move Gandhi believed would permanently divide Hindu society. And so, he made one of the most dangerous decisions of his life. He began a fast unto death. The country erupted. Crowds gathered outside the prison where he was held. Leaders from all communities, terrified of losing him, negotiated day and night. Gandhi grew physically weak, his voice faint, his body thinning, yet his resolve remained unbroken. He believed deeply that India could not be liberated on a foundation fractured by caste separation. As his health deteriorated, public pressure mounted, and finally, a compromise was reached. The Pune Pact. The immediate crisis ended, but Gandhi's health never fully recovered from the strain of that fast. Those close to him observed that after this event, something in Gandhi shifted. His body appeared more fragile. His eyes carried a deeper weariness, but his sense of purpose grew sharper, more unwavering. It was as though suffering had burned away any lingering hesitation, leaving only clarity behind. And yet, destiny had far more to demand from him, far more than even he could foresee. because the next phase of Gandhi's journey would confront him with forces he had never faced before. Global war, national impatience, and the growing realization that the most difficult enemy to defeat is not the oppressor, but the divisions within one's own people. And soon, Gandhi would be asked to lead India through a storm unlike anything it had ever known. As the 1930s slipped into the 1940s, India's struggle was no longer a distant dream, but an urgent demand pulsing from every corner of the country. And yet, the path ahead grew more tangled with each passing year. The world was engulfed in war. The British Empire, strained and vulnerable, clung to India more tightly than ever. Meanwhile, within India itself, divisions deepened, not just between Hindus and Muslims, but between generations, ideologies, and visions of the future. Gandhi, now older and increasingly frail, was thrust once again into the center of a storm, not of his making, but one he could not ignore. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 forced a crucial question upon India. Could it support the British war effort while still demanding freedom from the very empire it was expected to defend? To Gandhi, the answer was clear. A nation enslaved could not be morally compelled to fight for the freedom of another. But to others, especially leaders like Subhas Chandra Bose, who believed in a more militant path, the war presented an opportunity to pressure Britain through force. Gandhi found himself standing at a crossroads, where every direction carried risk. He could not support violence, yet refusing cooperation invited accusations of irresponsibility in a world facing catastrophe. When the British unilaterally declared India a participant in the war without consulting its leaders, indignation rippled across the nation. Gandhi wrote to the viceroy, urging dialogue, urging recognition, urging reason. The response was evasive. And so, Gandhi turned once again to the only weapon he believed a powerless nation possessed: moral resistance. Still, inside him, a quiet uncertainty grew. Was nonviolence strong enough to withstand a world consumed by violence? He wrestled with this question often, pacing slowly through the ashram, leaning on his walking stick as if balancing the country's fragile hope upon it. The tension escalated until 1942, when Gandhi made a declaration that would echo across history: "Quit India." With those two words, spoken with the calm force of conviction, he demanded an immediate end to British rule. No gradual reforms, no phased autonomy, no negotiations postponed until after the war. This was the moment India would stand tall, even if it trembled. Crowds erupted in thunderous support. The British, alarmed and enraged, acted swiftly. Gandhi and almost all major Congress leaders were arrested within hours, thrown into prisons across the country. And this time, Gandhi was not sent to a simple cell. He was confined in the Aga Khan Palace, a place beautiful in appearance but suffocating in purpose. Here, he faced the deepest personal tragedies of his life. Kasturba, his partner through decades of sacrifice, fell severely ill. Gandhi nursed her with gentle devotion, preparing her meals, massaging her feet, sitting beside her for hours as she weakened. But he could not stop the unfolding of fate. On February 22, 1944, Kasturba passed away in his arms. Gandhi held her hand as her breaths faded, his own heart breaking in a silence too heavy for words. In that moment, the man who had stood unshaken before empires bent under the weight of love lost. His secretary and closest aide, Mahadev Desai, had also died suddenly in the same prison just months earlier. Two losses, both intimate, both unbearable, struck Gandhi within a short span. The grief hollowed him. Those who saw him during this period said he seemed carved from something softer than before, as though sorrow had smoothed his edges but deepened his core. He continued spinning cotton, writing, praying, but each act carried a quiet heaviness. And perhaps this is where destiny reveals its most sobering truth. Even those chosen to move nations are not spared the losses that move the human heart. Amid personal grief, Gandhi's body weakened. His blood pressure dropped. His energy waned. Yet his mind remained sharp, watching from confinement as India descended into unrest. The Quit India movement, leaderless but determined, erupted into strikes, sabotage, and violent clashes, far from the nonviolent discipline Gandhi had always demanded. He blamed himself. He wondered whether he had asked too much of an anguished nation or misjudged the timing of the call. But he also sensed that deep transformations often come clothed in turmoil, that history rarely unfolds neatly. In 1944, fearing that Gandhi might die in captivity and trigger national revolt, the British released him. He emerged from prison a thinner, older man, visibly aged by grief, visibly burdened by the weight of the world he had tried to hold together. Yet something inside him remained unbroken. As he stepped into the sunlight, leaning on his walking stick, he whispered to a companion, "My work is not finished." And indeed, the greatest challenge of his life still lay ahead. Because while the British were weakening under global pressure, India was fracturing faster than anyone expected. The Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, demanded a separate nation for Muslims, Pakistan. Gandhi, who had dedicated decades to unity, felt this demand as a personal wound. He understood Muslim fears, but he also believed almost desperately that partition would carve lasting bitterness into the subcontinent's future. He met Jinnah many times, pleading, persuading, appealing to shared humanity rather than politics. But the divide had grown too deep. Each conversation ended in stalemate. Gandhi grew increasingly alone in his belief that India could remain whole. Political leaders on both sides saw partition as the only viable exit from escalating tension. Gandhi's vision of unity, once admired, was now considered unrealistic, even obstructive. He carried this rejection with a quiet pain. For the first time, he sensed that destiny was moving toward an outcome he could not prevent. Yet even in the face of a dividing nation, he continued walking, speaking, persuading, holding on to the faint hope that something unforeseen might turn the tide. But the tide was stronger than any single man, even one shaped so profoundly by conviction. And soon, Gandhi would face a crisis that would test not only his philosophy, but the limits of his endurance and the limits of India's soul. By the mid-1940s, the storm Gandhi had feared for years finally broke across India. As negotiations intensified and the prospect of partition loomed closer, the country descended into a darkness unlike anything Gandhi had ever witnessed. Communities that had lived side by side for centuries now turned against each other with terrifying speed. Rumors ignited mobs. Fear turned neighbors into enemies. Streets echoed with cries of grief and vengeance. Gandhi, who had spent a lifetime preaching unity, watched helplessly as the nation fractured before his eyes. And perhaps the greatest sorrow was not merely the violence itself, but the realization that the land he loved was tearing itself apart faster than he could stitch it together. In 1947, after decades of resistance, sacrifice, and negotiation, India finally achieved independence. The Union Jack came down. The tricolor rose. Fireworks filled the night sky. Crowds celebrated in the streets, voices raised in triumph. But Gandhi was not there. He refused to participate in the celebrations. While the new leaders gathered in New Delhi to mark the birth of a free nation, Gandhi walked alone through the riot-torn lanes of Calcutta, surrounded not by festivity, but by fire and blood. For him, independence without unity was a wound, not a victory. And he could not celebrate while the country bled. His heart ached most for the ordinary people, those who had no interest in politics, who simply wanted to live in peace, yet were now paying the price of decisions made in meeting rooms far from their lives. He saw trains arriving with corpses. He saw families fleeing with nothing but the clothes on their backs. He saw children searching for parents lost in the chaos. Each scene pierced him deeply. He wondered whether his life's work had failed at the crucial moment. And in the quiet of night, he asked himself a haunting question. What is freedom worth if it costs a nation its soul? Gandhi walked into these burning neighborhoods, not with guards, not with weapons, not with authority, but with a frail body and a voice that carried decades of sacrifice. He spoke to enraged mobs with the tenderness of a father, appealing to their conscience, their humanity, their forgotten compassion. Some listened, some scoffed, some lowered their weapons, others wept. Yet Gandhi kept walking through the debris of shattered trust, believing, perhaps more fiercely than ever, that the darkness would yield if even a small flame of moral courage remained. In August 1947, when new borders were drawn and Pakistan came into existence, Gandhi faced a dilemma he had dreaded: how to honor the right of a people seeking security while mourning the division of a land he believed was meant to stay whole. He accepted the democratic legitimacy of Pakistan's creation, but he refused to accept the hatred that accompanied it. He visited Muslim homes that had been attacked. He comforted Hindu families who had lost loved ones. He urged both sides to see that their suffering was born not from each other, but from the deep wounds inflicted by fear and manipulation. Yet he knew his words now carried less influence than before. Few were willing to listen in the midst of such devastation. In September of that year, Gandhi traveled to Calcutta once more, where communal violence threatened to engulf the city. When persuasion and negotiation failed, he turned to the only weapon he had always trusted: self-sacrifice. He announced a fast unto death unless the violence stopped completely. It was a desperate act, one that shocked both supporters and critics. But Gandhi believed that in moments of overwhelming hatred, moral force had to be demonstrated, not merely spoken. The city trembled. Leaders from all communities pleaded with people to lay down their weapons. Mobs paused, unsure whether they could bear the burden of causing Gandhi's death. Slowly, almost miraculously, the violence subsided. For a brief moment, Calcutta tasted peace, and Gandhi, lying weak and pale on a simple cot, opened his eyes to news that the city had calmed. His fast ended, but those close to him saw something in his expression. Relief, yes, but also exhaustion. This victory had cost him more than any before it. Still, the peace did not last everywhere. In January 1948, as tensions rose again in Delhi, Gandhi moved to the capital, determined, once again, to place himself at the center of the conflict. He stayed in Birla House, a simple compound where he prayed with people from all religions, urging reconciliation with a voice weakened by age and repeated fasts. His presence brought calm to many, but it also brought anger from those who saw him as favoring one community over another. Extremists accused him of betraying Hindu interests by advocating payments to Pakistan. Threats began to circulate quietly. Yet Gandhi carried on with the calm of a man who sensed his path nearing its end. He walked slowly, leaning on others for support. His prayers grew longer, his words softer. And even though he rarely spoke about destiny, those who listened to him felt he was preparing, not for a political triumph, but for a final act of surrender to the work he had devoted his life to. There was an unmistakable fragility to him, as though the burdens of decades had settled into his bones. On the evening of January 30th, 1948, Gandhi left his simple room for a prayer meeting in the garden of Birla House. He moved slowly, greeting people gently as he walked. The crowd parted for him. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the ground. And then, in a moment that still echoes painfully through history, shots rang out. Gandhi fell forward, hands clasped as if in prayer, murmuring the name of God with his final breath. India froze. The world froze. Millions felt as if something irreplaceable had just been taken from them. But in that stillness, one question lingered quietly, painfully. Was this the price destiny required of a man who had given everything, even his life, for the idea that love could overcome fear? In the days following Gandhi's assassination, India moved as though trapped between two worlds, one newly born in freedom and one suddenly orphaned. Crowds filled the streets in stunned silence. People who had once disagreed with him, criticized him, or simply taken his presence for granted, now felt a hollow ache echoing through the country. Newspapers called him the father of the nation, but ordinary people wept not for a symbol, but for a man whose frail frame had carried their hopes longer than they realized. It was as if India itself stopped breathing for a moment, unsure how to move forward without the quiet voice that had guided it for decades. His funeral procession stretched for miles. Millions lined the streets, some crying openly, some praying, some simply standing still with a reverence that revealed how deeply he had entered the country's soul. The pyre burned brightly, a flame rising against the dusk, echoing the last embers of a life lived with relentless discipline and unshakable conviction. And as the smoke rose, one could almost feel the weight of an unspoken question settling upon the nation. What happens when the conscience of a people is laid to rest? Who carries its burden then? But Gandhi had never believed that conscience belonged to any one person. He believed it lived within the smallest, quietest decisions each individual makes. Decisions unseen by history, but essential to shaping it. Long before his final breath, he had insisted repeatedly that the true measure of India's freedom would not lie in independence alone, but in the moral courage of its people. To him, freedom was not a date on the calendar. It was a lifelong discipline. And perhaps destiny's final task for him was to force the country to carry that discipline without relying on him to embody it. In the days that followed, leaders spoke of Gandhi's greatness, but those who had walked alongside him remembered something different. They remembered his humility, how he washed his own clothes, spun his own cloth, swept his own room. They remembered his gentleness, how he listened more than he spoke, how he believed that even the fiercest opponent carried a spark of humanity. They remembered his moments of doubt, his private fears, his grief, his exhaustion, and it was precisely these vulnerabilities, these unmistakably human moments, that made his moral strength so powerful. For Gandhi's life had never been a straight ascent. It had been a series of awakenings, each born out of failure, humiliation, heartbreak, or injustice. As a timid child afraid of the dark, he learned courage by confronting his own conscience. As a young lawyer thrown from a train, he discovered the sting of discrimination. As a leader torn between the demands of a nation and the needs of his family, he learned the unbearable weight of sacrifice. And as an old man watching the country divide, he learned that even the greatest efforts cannot always bend destiny the way we wish. And yet, he never surrendered to despair. He moved forward with a quiet understanding that the work entrusted to him was only one part of a much larger story. Perhaps that is why he walked everywhere, barefoot or in simple sandals, because he understood that leadership meant touching the earth closely, feeling the reality of those who suffered, grounding oneself in humility. In every step he took, in every fast he observed, in every injustice he confronted, there was always the question of whether suffering could be transformed into meaning. And Gandhi's answer, again and again, was yes. There is a moment often overlooked in recounting his life. His insistence that true change begins in silence, not in crowds or marches or negotiations, but in the solitude where a person confronts what they fear, what they hide, what they avoid. Gandhi believed that if a person could master the violence inside themselves, anger, resentment, prejudice, then the violence outside would lose its power. And perhaps this was the heart of his legacy. Not that he led millions, but that he taught millions the possibility of leading themselves. As India stepped into its new life without him, the question shifted from what Gandhi had done to what he had revealed. That courage can be gentle, that resistance can be patient, that truth can be stronger than armies, and that a single life lived with unwavering purpose can ripple across continents. But the deeper takeaway is more uncomfortable. What part of his example are we willing to carry? Not the spinning wheel or the marches, but the discipline of self-examination, the refusal to hate, the commitment to unity, even when unity feels impossible. Because the lesson Gandhi's journey leaves us with is not one of triumph, but one of responsibility. Freedom is fragile. Peace is fragile. Conscience is fragile. And if his life teaches us anything, it is that these fragile things survive only when ordinary people choose to protect them, quietly, consistently, courageously. So tonight, as we sit by this quiet fireside, reflecting on the path of a man who walked farther than his feet should have allowed, who carried more than any one heart should bear, perhaps the question we should ask ourselves is not what Gandhi accomplished, but what he revealed about us. Will we choose dignity when anger feels easier? Will we choose unity when division feels justified? Will we recognize the unseen guidance shaping our own lives, even when the path feels uncertain? And ultimately, if fate placed us in a moment of choice, as it placed him, what kind of courage would we offer the world? Thank you for spending this evening with us, one of our little circle gathered around the fireside. May the quiet strength of this journey stay with you long after the flames fade. If the story touched your heart, share it to the ones you love. And if you would like to listen to more like it, you know where to find us.